7 has to do with ensuring faithful implementation of best practices at the school level, and I think I've already commented a bit on that. And that has to do with making changes in practices, monitoring classrooms, and having collegial support at the school level. If you were to ask me, what is the most important level of analysis for gifted programs to truly be successful, I would have to say at the school level is that level of analysis, because it involves not one classroom, but multiple classrooms, not one grade level, but multiple grade levels, not one subject area, but multiple subject areas. It involves the leadership of the principal and the staff focusing on how do we make curriculum, instruction, and assessment as powerful as it can be for our very best learners. That question has to be front and center in terms of ensuring that this problem can be adequately addressed. And sometimes I think we don't always go about the change process in an appropriate way. Tom Guskey's work on professional development has suggested that what we're really trying to change is not teacher attitudes, not first. What we're trying to change is classroom practice. So all professional development needs to be focused on what are the changes in the classroom that we want teachers to make immediately. Because if teachers don't make those changes and they don't see the student learning that results from those changes, then their attitudes are not going to change. But fundamentally, there is no testing ground in classrooms in the absence of this possibility. We also certainly know in terms of professional development that there are certain things that go on. This is, again, not out of the gifted literature, but out of the general literature on professional development, that certain things are better when it comes to engaging in professional development, not tackling the whole world, but focusing on specific content knowledge is a very good place to start with teachers. And how do you take that content knowledge and elevate it to higher levels? So taking just one concept within the teaching of science, for example, one concept, how does it translate at different grade levels? What are the ways of elevating your question asking related to teaching that concept? How are you going to ensure that students are engaging in productive thought and productive action related to their work? That becomes then the focus of a positive and powerful professional development program. We also know, in the United States anyway, that there are that innovation in schools can be supported well if we see, again, the importance of certain factors put in place. The factors of ensuring that teachers see student engagement and excitement. That factor alone is more responsible for teacher change than actually even seeing achievement results. So knowing that becomes important in terms of how we, in fact, train teachers and continue to work with them effectively. We also want to be sure that whatever we're doing supports the general system that's already in place to some extent, to the extent that it can. If we have systems in place that support innovation, then it is more likely to occur and to continue than if we don't have those systems in place. I'll give you one example, I think maybe the most important that I've seen in schools, and that is schools have to be flexible. They can't always think that if it's Friday and it's 2 o'clock, everybody's working on the math problems, if you're in elementary school. Or if you're in a secondary school, that the last 15 minutes are always used to bring closure to the particular activity of the day. There is a need for flexible delivery and for flexible use of time, which, again, if schools are going to be experimental enough to promote innovation, that kind of flexibility will be an essential part of what is provided. I've included some examples of our classroom observation scale that we have used with teachers that I think is also a good way to go in terms of promoting greater differentiation. Everybody on the same page as to what it is, teachers self-rating on that scale, and then working with the results in order to improve their own differentiation practices. And then, of course, the 8th problem has to do with aligning gifted practices with general education and with the kinds of standards and assessments that we work with across schools. And using those core standards as the basis of incorporating differentiation, I think, is the only way that we can make that happen. Articulating differentiated scope and sequence charts becomes a part of that process. In the United States, we are dealing now with a new set of common core standards. And these processes that I'm speaking to in terms of alignment are ones that we have promoted and are continuing to promote within the gifted community to ensure that the standards are met by everybody, including the gifted, but that what the gifted are engaged in goes beyond those standards at deeper levels and in more complex and creative contexts. One way to think about the scope and sequence idea that I'm raising is to say, what is it that needs to happen to students from the time they enter school until they enter university relative to the subject matter areas that they are most proficient in? What are some of the things that they need to have opportunities to do? So in mathematics, for example, having early exposure to things like science museums, mathematical games and puzzles is very important from a very early age. One of the math prodigies that I've had the pleasure of working with began when he was 2 years old, starting to memorize residential numbers in terms of addresses, and then moved from that into memorizing license plates on cars when the family would take a vacation. And then his parents encouraged him, well, write those down and begin to see, are there some patterns that you can identify within these numbers? And that kept him, as a preschooler, happy as a clam for a very long time in terms of being able to focus on numbers at that level, not being shut down in terms of doing it, but encouraged to do it and encouraged to engage in that meaning making that relates to the patterns that he was able to accrue. So those early opportunities, coupled with then a systematic set of additional opportunities at each stage of development across the K-12 spectrum, becomes a really powerful way to ensure that articulation of content can be as meaningful as possible for gifted and talented students. Now you might say, don't you want this for everybody? Well, yes, if everybody really was willing to engage. First of all, most gifted and talented students can't engage in all subject matter areas to the deep level that even this math example represents. Only those who become interested in math, motivated to do math, and have these opportunities are going to be the ones that are going to be able to continue this trajectory. So the qualities of the individual student many times come to collude with social realities in order to ensure or in fact take away from the student being able to proceed through any one of these trajectories in an expected manner. All of that said, let me end with two things. The first, a quote from T.S. Eliot, which over time I have begun to appreciate more and more. And that is from his 4 quartets: we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. When I was preparing for this presentation, I was going back to many of my early presentations on curriculum and instruction and assessment. And I realized, going back even to the mid-70s, that some of the same ideas I was talking about then. I must assure you, however, that today, 45 years later, I understand those ideas much more deeply, understand their applications much more effectively, and hope that you too will come to appreciate that the more you work with differentiating your curriculum, your instruction, your assessment for the gifted, the more successful you will be. And then finally, I will leave up 2 websites that may be useful for you. One is my own website page that has relevant publications that I have alluded to in this presentation, as well as the What Works publication from the Center for Gifted Education. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
So hopefully you can hear us.
Okay, I can. So far, anyway. I can.
Morning, Joyce. I'm Anil Ahiri. I have
Hello.
a question to you. First of all, I must say that having listened to you, I feel I'm a little more gifted than I was. I was not gifted at all. Right. Having said
That's
that,
probably by comparison, right?
yeah, that's right. The question I have is very, very rudimentary. Very rudimentary. And that is that you talked about complexity and you talked about, higher level of thinking.
The new microphone, I cannot hear the question.
This is dedicated to that microphone. Thank you. I was saying that you talked about complexity and obviously calls for a high level of thinking. Now, unfortunately, giftedness is not at one level. It's not at one single level.
Right.
There are degrees of giftedness. Now, all you said about gifted students, the nurturing, development of gifted students, I completely agree. Right? It resonates. But there is a problem, however, which leaves me a little concerned. On the one level, if you didn't have special schools for gifted children, then you will probably retard the children who are gifted, right? Students who are gifted. But now you created another problem where, because there are levels of giftedness, what you do, complexity and so on and so forth, engages people at one level of giftedness, but then you leave out statistically the highest, that rung, statistically the highest in numbers, which probably will not be able to maintain that kind of, keep pace with that kind of, that level of thinking. And so are you basically creating another level, which is a disaster, because the highest numbers, gifted to some extent, but have not been able to cope up with what has been tailored and customized for the really gifted people, gifted students. So how do you solve this dichotomy?
Right. Well, first of all, I really appreciate your question because I think that focusing on levels of giftedness is an important part of the planning process that we need to do within schools, within regions, as well as within societies. Separate schools for the gifted is a very good strategy for the highly gifted in any society. And I think we have good support structures and good evidence that suggests that those programs are highly successful and do many times what we would want to have happen for our most gifted students. But as you suggest, not everyone is highly gifted. And not only the highly gifted, in my view, should be served by programs for the gifted. I think we also need to have in place different levels of service delivery for gifted students in any given context. One of our districts here in Virginia, for example, delivers systematically 4 different levels of service. The top level of service is done in a separate center model, both elementary and middle schools, and then a separate high school as well. But then the same curriculum and instructional opportunities are available in the neighborhood school for those schools that feel they have a population base that can benefit from that same high-level set of opportunities. And then below that, different levels of service delivery, many times involving fewer content areas, so that we're not looking necessarily at comprehensive programs for our more mildly or moderately gifted students, but rather looking within the area in which they're the strongest and in need of the greatest intervention, becomes another level of service delivery. And for others, it may be in 2 or 3 areas that they need special intervention. So the diagnostic information that we gather about learners when we begin to do curriculum planning becomes another very important overlay to everything that I've said about these general principles of differentiation and how they tend to get applied. The level of